Hi, welcome to True Crime Talk. I'm Kathleen, and today I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the Hinterkaifeck murders in Germany. I'm going to start off with Wikipedia. I know Wikipedia is not always accurate and isn't the greatest website for information, but sometimes they have the correct basics. So I'm going to start with Wikipedia to see what they have to say about the Hinterkaifeck murders. And please forgive me for mispronouncing words. I am not German, I don't speak German, so I know I'm going to mispronounce a lot of these words. It says, the Hinterkaifeck murders occurred on the evening of 31 March 1922 when 6 inhabitants of a small Bavarian farmstead located approximately 70 kilometers 43 miles north of Munich, Germany, were murdered by an unknown assailant. The 6 victims were Andreas Gruber, age 63, his wife Cecilia Gruber, age 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, age 35, Victoria's children Cecilia, age 7, and Joseph, age 2, and the maid Maria Baumgartner, age 44. They were all found struck with a mattock, also known as a grub axe. The perpetrators lived with the 6 corpses of their victims for 3 days. During this time, they ate the food in the house, fed the animals on the property, and started fires in the home's fireplace. 4 of the dead bodies were found stacked up in the barn, the victims likely having been lured there one by one. Prior to the incident, the family and their former maid had reported hearing strange noises coming from the attic, which led to that maid leaving. The case remains unsolved to this day and is considered one of the most gruesome and puzzling unsolved crimes in German history. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was built around 1863. The name Hinterkaifeck comes from its location, Hinter meaning behind in German and Kaifeck being a small nearby hamlet. Hence its German name. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was essentially located behind Kaifeck, or more precisely about 1 mile north of it, and bordered by dense woods. Less than a year after the murders and the murder investigation, the farm was completely demolished to remove the remainder of the violence that had taken place there. During the demolition, additional evidence was revealed, including a mattock covered in dried blood hidden in the attic and a penknife in the hay in the barn. After the demolition, a small concrete monument known as the Hinterkaifeck in Dachstadt was erected close to where the farm once stood, serving as a memorial to the victims. Prelude. There were some strange occurrences in and around Hinterkaifeck sometime shortly before the attack. 6 months prior to the attack, Crescens Franger, the family maid at the time, had quit. It had been widely claimed that her reason for leaving was that she had heard strange noises in the attic and believed the house to be haunted. Andreas Gruber found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property in March 1922. He could not remember buying it and initially believed that the postman had lost the newspaper. This was not the case, however, as no one in the vicinity subscribed to the paper. Just days before the murders, Gruber told neighbors he had discovered tracks in the fresh snow that led from the forest to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. Later, during the night, they heard footsteps in the attic, but Gruber found no one when he searched the building. Although he told several people about these alleged observations, he refused offers of help, and the details went unreported to the police. According to a school friend of the 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, the young girl reported that her mother Victoria had fled the farm the night before the act after a violent quarrel and only hours later had been found in the forest. On the afternoon of Friday, 31st March 1922, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the farm after a short stay. She was most likely the last person to see the inhabitants alive. Maria Baumgartner had only worked for 1 day before the murders. It appears that in the late evening, Victoria Gabriel, her 7-year-old daughter Cecilia, and her parents, Andres and Cecilia, were lured to the family barn through the stable, where they were murdered one at a time. The perpetrators used a mattock belonging to the family farm and killed the family with blows to the head. The perpetrators then moved into the living quarters where, with the same murder weapon, they killed Joseph sleeping in his bassinet and Baumgartner in her bedchamber. 4 days passed between the murders and the discovery of the bodies. On April 1st, coffee sellers Hans Chervasky and Edward Chervasky arrived in Hinterkaifeck to take an order. When no one responded to the knocks on the door and the window, they walked around the yard but found no one. They noticed that the gate to the machine house was open and then decided to leave. Cecilia Gabriel was absent from school without excuse for the next few days, and the family failed to show up for Sunday worship. Local mechanic Albert Hoffner went to Hinterkaifeck on April 4th to repair an engine. He stated that he had not seen any of the family and had heard nothing but the sounds of the farm animals and the dog inside the barn. After waiting for an hour, he decided to start his repair, which he completed in roughly 4.5 hours. Around 3:30 p.m., Lorenz Sittenbauer sent his son Johann, 16, and stepson Joseph, 9, to Hinterkaifeck to see if they could make contact with the family. When they reported that they had not seen anyone, Schlittenbauer headed to the farm the same day with Michael Pohl and Jacob Siegel. Entering the barn, they found the bodies of Andres Gruber, his wife Cecilia Gruber, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and his granddaughter Cecilia. Shortly afterwards, they found the chambermaid Maria Baumgartner and the youngest family member Joseph murdered in the homestead. Inspector George Reingruber and his department investigated the killings. Initial investigations were hampered by the number of people who had interacted with the crime scene, moved bodies and items around, and even cooked and eaten meals in the kitchen. The day after the discovery of the bodies, court physician Johann Baptist Müller performed autopsies in the barn. It was established that a mattock was the most likely murder weapon, although the weapon itself was not found at the scene. Evidence showed that the younger Cecilia had been alive for several hours after the assault. She had torn her hair out in tufts while lying in the straw. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. First suspecting the motive to be robbery, the police interrogated traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages, but they abandoned this theory when a large amount of money was found in the house. It was clear that the perpetrators had remained at the farm for several days. Someone had fed the cattle, consumed the entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With no clear motive to be gleaned from the crime scene, the police began to formulate a list of suspects. Despite repeated arrests, no murderer has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955. The last interrogations took place in 1986 before Detective Chief Superintendent Conrad Mueller retired. In the inspection record of the court commission, it was noted that the victims were probably drawn to the barn by restlessness in the stable resulting in noises from the animals. A later attempt, however, revealed that at least human screams from the barn could not be heard in the living area. On the night after the crime, 3 days before the bodies were discovered, the artisan Michael Plockel happened to pass by Hinterkaifeck. He observed that the oven had been heated by someone. That person had approached him with a lantern and blinded him, whereupon he hastily continued on his way. Plockel also noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a revolting smell. This incident was not followed up, and no investigation was conducted to determine what had been burned that night in the oven. On 1 April at 3 a.m., the farmer and butcher Simon Reinblander, on his way home near Brunnen, saw two mysterious figures at the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen. Later, when he heard of the murders in Hinterkaifeck, he thought it possible that the strangers might be involved. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight, asking him questions about the murder before shouting that he was the murderer and then running into the woods. The stranger was never identified. Suspects: Carl Gabriel. Carl Gabriel was the husband of widowed Victoria Gabriel. He had reportedly been killed in December 1914 during the First World War by a shell attack in Arras, France, but his body had never been recovered. After the murders, people began to speculate about whether he had in fact died in the war. Victoria had conceived and given birth to her son Joseph in her husband's absence. The boy was rumored to have been the product of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father Andreas, which was documented in court and known in the village. Andreas was found to be raping his daughter, and the town convicted them both of incest. After the end of the Second World War, war captives from the Schwabenhausen region, who were released prematurely from Soviet captivity, claimed that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. However, some of the men later revised their statements, which diminishes their credibility. Some theorized that the Soviet officer in question might have been Carl Gabriel, because those who claimed to have seen Gabriel after his reported death testified that he had wanted to go to Russia. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Shortly after the death of his first wife in 1918, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was believed to have had a relationship with Victoria Gabriel and fathered Joseph. Schlittenbauer came under suspicion by locals early in the investigation because of his several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the bodies. When Schlittenbauer and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door with a key and suspiciously entered the house alone. A key to the house had gone missing several days before the murders, though it is also possible that Schlittenbauer, as a neighbor or as Victoria's potential lover, might have been given a key. When asked by his companions why he had gone into the house alone when it was unclear if the murderer might still be there, Schlittenbauer allegedly stated that he went to look for his son Joseph. It is known that Schlittenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For many years after, local suspicion remained on Schlittenbauer because of his strange comments, which were seen as indicating knowledge of details that only the killer would recall. According to information in the files for the case, local teacher Hans Weiblager discovered Schlittenbauer visiting the remains of the demolished Hinterkaifeck in 1925. Upon being asked why he was there, Schlittenbauer stated that the perpetrator's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that Schlittenbauer had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the murders. Although being a neighbor and familiar with the local land, he may have been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Schlittenbauer murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Joseph. Before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer conducted and won several civil claims for slander against persons who described him as the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Gump brothers. Adolf Gump was listed as a suspect as early as April 9th due to his connections to the Freikorps Oberland. As a Freikorps member, Gump was said to have participated in the murder of 9 farmers in Upper Silesia during the fight against the 1921 Polish uprising in the region. He had a warrant for his arrest issued by the District Court of Opole. In 1951, prosecutor Andres Popp investigated brothers Adolf and Anton Gump about the murders at Hinterkaifeck. Their sister, Crescentia Mayer, claimed on her deathbed that Adolf and Anton had committed the murders. As a result, Anton Gump was remanded to police custody, but Adolf had already died in 1944. After a short time, however, Anton was dismissed again, and in 1954, the case against him was finally discontinued because he could not be proven to have participated in the crime. Carl S. and Andreas S. In 1971, a woman named Therese T. wrote a letter citing an event in her youth. At the age of 12, she witnessed her mother receiving a visit from the mother of the brothers Carl and Andreas S. The woman claimed that her sons from Saddleburg were the two murderers of Hinterkaifeck. The mother said Andreas regretted that he lost his penknife in the course of the conversation. In fact, when the farm was demolished in 1923, a pocket knife was found that could not be clearly assigned to anyone. However, the knife could have easily belonged to one of the murder victims. This track was followed without result. Cousins Reiger, the former maid of Hinterkaifeck, was certain she had already seen the penknife in the yard during her service. Peter Weber. Peter Weber was named a suspect by Joseph Betts. The two worked together in the winter of 1919 and 1920 as laborers, and they shared a room. According to Betts, Weber spoke of a remote farm, Hinterkaifeck. Weber knew that only one old couple lived there with their daughter and her two children. It is likely he knew about the incest between Gruber and his daughter. Betts testified in a hearing that Weber had suggested killing the old man to get the family's money. When Betts did not respond to the offer, Weber stopped talking about it. Bichler brothers and George Siegel. The former maid, Cousins Reiger, worked from November 1920 to about September 1921 at Hinterkaifeck. She suspected the brothers Anton and Carl Bichler to have committed the murders. Anton Bichler had helped with the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and therefore knew the premises. Reiger said Bichler talked to her often about the Gruber and Gabriel family. Anton reportedly suggested that the family ought to be dead. The maid also emphasized in her interrogation that the farm dog who barked at everyone never barked at Anton. In addition, she reported speaking with a stranger through her window at night. The maid believed that it was Carl Bichler, the brother of Anton. She thought that Anton and Carl Bichler could have committed the murder together with George Siegel, who had worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew of the family fortune. Supposedly, Siegel had broken into the home in November 1920 and stolen a number of items, so he denied it. He did state that he had carved the handle of the murder weapon when he was working at Hinterkaifeck and knew that the two would have been kept in the barn passage. Thaler brothers. The Thaler brothers were also suspected, according to a statement by the former maid, Cousins Reiger. The brothers had already committed several minor burglaries in the area before the crime. Reiger said that Joseph Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, but she did not answer. Why are all these people standing at the maid's window? Okay, whatever. In conversation, Joseph Thaler claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. During the conversation, Reiger noted that there was another person nearby. According to her statement, Joseph Thaler and the stranger had looked at the machine house and turned their eyes upwards. And I'm beginning to think maybe the maid set the family up with somebody. This one of these pairs of brothers, or maybe more than one pair of brothers. Paul Mueller. Arthur Beale James, in his book The Man from the Train, alleges that a man known as Paul Mueller, a German migrant, may have been responsible for the murders. Mueller was the only suspect in the 1898 murder of a Massachusetts family, and James believes Mueller killed dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. The Hinterkaifeck murders bear some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes in the U.S., including the slaughter of an entire family in their isolated home, use of the blunt edge of a farm tool as a weapon, a pickaxe, moving and stacking bodies of the victims, and the apparent absence of robbery as a motive. James suspects that Mueller, described as a German immigrant in contemporary media, might have departed the U.S. for his homeland by 1912 after private investigators and journalists began to notice and publicize patterns in family murders across state lines. Many books and newspaper articles have been devoted to the murders. A series of articles by Joseph Ludwig Hecker in the Stromenhausener Zeitung revived interest in the murders. A documentary film, Hinterkaifeck, Symbol des Unheimlichen, and I know I'm not pronouncing that right, 1981, is based on the Leuschner book. Hans Fiegert adapted the book, directed the film, shot on Super 8 with sound, and was the cameraman. The film was shown regularly in Ingolstadt. 10 years later, Reinhard Keilig's play Hinterkaifeck, Deutschland's Geheimnisverwahrsster Mordfall, 1991, was produced, and at the same time Kurt K. Heiber produced another documentary shot on location and shown on television and in local cinemas. Also in 1991, radio station Funkhaus Ingolstadt aired a documentary Hinterkaifeck, often Spielen eines Mordes, and the Benzenton ran a series of articles called Die Sechs Toten vom Innenhof Bayerns Wieselhostes Verbrechen, and I know I'm pronouncing all that wrong. I'm not even trying anymore. In 2006, German author Andrea Maria Schinkel published the novel Tonade, a fictionalized account of the murders, although the setting and names of those involved were changed. The novel sold over 1 million copies, was adapted into a film in 2009, and has been translated into 20 languages. In 2007, 15 students of the Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck examined the case using modern criminal investigation techniques. In their final report in German, they confirmed the meticulousness of the investigation at the time, but criticized the lack of professional forensics. In particular, the failure to take fingerprints was criticized. That was dumb. They didn't take fingerprints, as this was already common practice at the time. Although it is almost certain that the murderer or murderers can no longer be identified, all authors of the report independently agreed on who the main suspect in the case was. However, his name was not mentioned out of consideration for his descendants. Well, I wonder who they thought was the main suspect. In 2017, the last chapter of The Man from the Train by Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James briefly discusses the murders at Hinterkaifeck. The authors explain the possibility that the German crimes might have been committed by Paul Mueller, the titular serial killer the authors believe killed several families in the U.S. under similar circumstances between 1898 and 1912. The murders attributed to Mueller, including the Villisca axe murders, were apparently random nighttime home invasions in or near small railroad towns that left entire families bludgeoned to death with the blunt end of an axe, and were probably motivated by a sadistic and necrophilic attraction to prepubescent girls. The authors rate the chances of Mueller as the Hinterkaifeck killer as more or less a toss-up, but conclude there's no real reason to believe that it's not him. Well, that's not evidence. I'm sure there's serial killers in Germany just like the U.S., and there's no proof that this guy, to my understanding yet, that he went to Germany and was in the area at the time. In 2018, the murders were the subject of Season 2, Episode 3 of the Amazon TV series Lore. I'm going to look at these pictures now that Wikipedia has. This is the farm, the Hinterkaifeck farm. And this is the memorial that stands today. The farmhouse barn was demolished about a year after the murders, and they put up this memorial statue. It's like a beautiful area. See the forest back there and the farmland. So that's the two pictures that Wikipedia has. Okay, now I'm going to look at this website, the Hinterkaifeck website. It's in German and English, and of course I'm going to be looking at it in English. But this website has a lot of information about the murders. However, it is slanted to a certain suspect. I don't know who created this website. I mean, it says stuff down here. I don't read or speak German. But maybe those of you out there who do will know more about this website. But I'm going to first off talk about, there are books that this website has on it that are available. One is called The Lark's Call. It says it's a gripping crime novel based on the Hinterkaifeck murders. This is, to my understanding, a fictionalized story about the murders. Let me see. Underneath this crucifix, a peasant family of 5 and their maid lie in a family grave. All of them had their skulls smashed in. The extremely brutal murder did not even stop at Joseph, who was only 2.5 years old. He killed the boy with a single blow through the roof of the pram. The criminal police assumed a six-fold robbery murder, although all the money was left behind. The neighbors of the murdered family, however, suspected a man from their village of having committed the heinous act. He wanted to marry the beautiful farmer's daughter, but her father did not allow it. Did that man kill the whole family out of revenge, or did someone else have a dirty hand in it? Someone who was so close to the murdered family that no one paid any attention to him. It says it's available in paperback and ebook. After years of research, Adolf J. Koppel put together an immutable mosaic of circumstantial evidence that without a doubt convicts the murderer. The nonfiction book, The Gruber Wars, Gruber Did It, leaves no questions unanswered. Derived from the mosaic of circumstantial evidence, Adolf J. Koppel wrote the crime novel The Lark's Call, which presents the life and tragic death of the beautiful farmer's daughter Victoria Gabriel and her family down to the smallest detail. Okay, so this is The Lark's Call, and I think it's available in English. And I believe it's like a fiction, but it's, has based on the Hinterkaifeck story, but it's a lot of fiction in there. And then The Gruber's Wars, nonfiction book on the complete investigation of the Hinterkaifeck murder case. And this is currently only available in German. And it says this nonfiction book is not based on a six-fold robbery murder as previously assumed, but on a five-fold murder that took place within the Hinterkaifeck family. It was not an outsider who was responsible for the terrible deed, but the tyrannical and brutal head of the family, Andreas Gruber. It was he who, on March 31st, 1922, killed his wife, the maid, his daughter, and their 2 children. But if this man is supposed to have killed the people, how can it be that he was lying with the murdered people on the day they were found? Did the local guide, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, have anything to do with the matter? Did he come across the still living murderer during a patrol? And if so, how did the murderer die? And if Lorenz Schlittenbauer hunted down the alleged murderer, why didn't he call the police and explain everything to them? Okay, so this book definitely has their view on who did it, and they think the father, who was also murdered, did it. So I think they're saying that the father killed the family and then maybe Lorenz Schlittenbauer killed the father. I'm not sure. I haven't read the book, but it says nonfiction. But take it with a grain of salt of whether you believe their theory or not, because obviously nobody knows who exactly killed them, so his theory would be fiction. But it says it's a nonfiction book, so hopefully it has a lot of facts in it about the actual evidence and what happened to the family. So those are books that this site has on it that I guess they're selling or recommending. Now here are the pictures that they have. So we'll go through the pictures. Let's see. Okay, so this is another picture of the farm, obviously. And if you look close, you can see 3. Let me see if I can make it bigger. Well, that didn't help. There are 3 people standing up front that I can see. A person right here, a person right here, and a person right here. I believe this is Andreas Gruber right here. And then this is one of the people. What it says is Victoria Gruber, in one of the few moments in her life when she did not have to fear her father. So obviously this website is biased towards her father being the murderer. And they said this is Victoria. I can't tell. My eyesight's so bad. This is black and white. It's an old grainy picture. And to me it looks like a male. But apparently somewhere else I saw that they say that she's wearing like her father's slippers or something, and this is Victoria. But I can't say for sure, but that's what this website has. It says Victoria Gruber, approximately 13 years old, and one of the few moments in her life when she did not have to fear her father. So apparently, this is Victoria when she was 13. So let me go back to this picture. So I guess this is Victoria when she was 13 right here, and this is her father, Andreas, however old he was when she was 13. And I still don't know who's to the left here unless that's, looks like they're standing next to a bicycle. I can't tell if that's male or female, but possibly maybe it's her mother. Okay, it says the murderer deliberately chose the protruding screw to kill. So I guess they're talking about this on this side or here. I'm not sure exactly which protruding screw they're talking about. They're talking about this screw right here. I'm not sure, but apparently that's believed to be the murder weapon or what the murder weapon looked like. This picture has nothing to do with the murders. It's just a slaughterer killing the pig with a mattock, I guess to demonstrate how the family was murdered. So I'll move on from that. This is a crime scene photo. Andreas Gruber left, Victoria Gabriel middle, and on the right under the hay, Cecilia Gruber. The daughter's somewhere in there, but she's not shown. Okay, this is the maid's room. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, who arrived on the evening of March 31st, 1922, was beaten to death in her chamber shortly after her arrival. So this is the maid's room, and this is what her room looked like. She's laying on the floor. I don't know, it's an old black and white photo. I know it's an old farmhouse, but the walls and ceiling look dirty or possibly moldy or whatever. I don't know if that's what it really looked like or, I know it's not fingerprint powder because they didn't take fingerprints. So, and this is not the actual murder weapon. This is a replica to my understanding. Yeah, it says replica. If Hinterkaifeck farm had not been demolished, the murder weapon would never have been found. So they actually found the murder weapon when they demolished the farm, which means obviously the police made some mistakes when they were investigating this case. But it was 1922. They didn't have the forensics that they do today. No DNA, but they did have fingerprints, but they didn't take any fingerprints. But they didn't have the weapon. Maybe they would have took fingerprints from the weapon if they had found it sooner. Okay, this is the dog, the yellow Spitz. The dog on Hinterkaifeck was known as a very alert watchdog. None other than Lorenz Schlittenbauer had reason to express his frustration towards Andres Gruber in this death photo. Let's see, so this, I guess, announcing their deaths, the list of victims. In German, I don't read German obviously, but this list the names of the victims: Andreas Gruber, Cecilia Gruber, his wife, Victoria Gabriel, their adult daughter, Cecilia, her 7-year-old daughter, and Joseph, who they say was 3, but other places say he was 2.5. Maria Baumgartner, the maid. This is Jacob Siegel suspected the local leader Lorenz Schlittenbauer as he was behaving in an unusually conspicuous manner when the body was found. So this guy believed that Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the murderer. Okay, this is the guy who repaired the engine on the farm. I believe it's on April the 4th, 1922. Since no one was on the farm and animals were roaring loudly, he informed the local leader, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, to check on Hinterkaifeck. So one of the people who became like one of the main, if not the only main suspect in this case, was actually asked to go check on the family by this person here when he did not see them after he worked on a machine there. Pastor Haas knew the secret of Lorenz Schlittenbauer. So apparently this website thinks that this pastor knew what had happened because apparently Lorenz Schlittenbauer had confessed to him, I suppose. And here again is Victoria Gruber in Father's House Slippers and Andreas Gruber. So earlier it said she was 13 years old. It's just the picture looks so odd, but I mean, he looks like she just doesn't look like a girl to me, but it's an old picture. And there's Andreas Gann. At this time, it says he was approximately 42 years old. So this is what he looked like around the age of 42. Which he looked old there, so I wonder if they're correct about his age at this time. But it says the violent and tyrannical head of the family. And this is a mattock, what it looks like. And it says the screw protruded on both sides. So now I see the screw. Okay, so this screw protruded on both sides. So apparently they know the bodies had injuries from these screws in addition to this part. It said killing with the screw required practice and precise handling. So I assume that's what so they're saying that they were killed by like these screws, or is this also called a screw? I'm not sure. Maybe I'll find out as I research this more. That's what they call a mattock. And that's what they believe the weapon to be or to be like. I don't know if this is the actual one. An out-of-town perpetrator would have used the blade of the mattock to kill, not the barely visible screw. Oh, okay. So the killer used these screws instead of this. So that is odd. And so this website's theory is that an out-of-town perpetrator would have obviously used this and not these screws. Like, why would the killer use these screws? He didn't want to do that much damage because he knew them? Okay. And this is another crime scene photo. This is the barn where the bodies, or four of the bodies, were found. And Cecilia is not shown. And Joseph, who was only 3 years old, was brutally beaten to death in his prau. So apparently this is Joseph's mother's room, Victoria's room, and this is where he slept. And I guess that's where he was murdered, if I understand correctly. And this is a replica. Only an insider could know that there would be an ingenious hiding place for the mattock in the false floor above the kitchen. So apparently they found it in a false floor above the kitchen in the attic. And so the theory of this website is that whoever murdered them would have to know about that if they put the weapon there. Well, obviously whoever put the weapon there had to know that this place existed, and if the weapon was actually found there, then yes. But it says this is a replica, so the material you see on it, the hair and the blood, is just fake for a picture, I suppose. Okay, this is the Hinterkaifeck farm a few days after the murder. So somebody took time to take some crime scene photos, but nobody thought to get fingerprints and secure the crime scene. This is Detective Superintendent George Reingruber, and he took a completely wrong turn with his six-fold robbery murder theory. So he thought somebody came and murdered all six people. He didn't believe that the father, Andreas Gruber, was the murderer, and then he got killed, like this website does. And this is Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and this website says the good-natured Lorenz Schlittenbauer came under suspicion of having slain the Hinterkaifeckers all his life because of his great helpfulness. So obviously this website is slanted toward Lorenz and think Lorenz was a good-natured person and that he didn't commit this murder. Behind this cemetery wall, the 5 victims and their murderer lie in the same grave to this day. See black obelisks on the right edge of the picture. So the creators of this website say there are 5 victims lying with their murderer because they believe the father murdered them and not anybody else. This is Joseph Mayer, always brought the mail to Hinterkaifeck, so apparently he was like the mailman. And one time, Andreas Gruber thought that the mailman, possibly, I guess this guy, had left a newspaper at their house accidentally. I think it was from Munich. But the mailman said that he did not. So nobody knows where the Munich newspaper came from. Did Lorenz Schlittenbauer receive the Munich newspaper or have access to the Munich newspaper? Did he leave it there? If not, if he wasn't the killer, maybe the real killer is the one who had that newspaper and left it there. Okay, this was Victoria's husband who died in World War I. She hid the fact that she was expecting a child from her father. Carl Gabriel was killed on December 12, 1914 during World War I. So obviously we know Joseph wasn't his child. Now, could it be possible that the older daughter, Celia, who was named after her grandmother, is it possible that she was also not his daughter? That she was also a product of incest between Andres and Victoria? Or did Victoria have had another lover who was a father? Okay, so those are the pictures this website has. Evidence and clues. The suspected murderer. So remember, this website is biased towards the father, who was also killed along with, and his body found along with the family. They believe that he murdered the family and then somebody else murdered him. So the victims, they call him the suspected murderer. They believed he lived until April 1st, 1922. So he died the same time the family did, but let's see. Okay, Victoria Gabriel, she died from 9 holes in the skull on the right side of the head. So apparently she was beaten with this mattock and struck with the screws of the mattock rather than this part, the blade. So that was a heck of a way to kill somebody, but so definitely I think the murderer was a man to be able to physically do that, to kill all these people with, and to my understanding, they had no defensive wounds. Okay, so the victims, Victoria, Cecilia Gruber, who was the mother, she was found to have 8 holes in the right side of the skull. So far, these first 2 victims were hit in the right side of their heads. Maria Baumgartner, killed by at least 1 hole in the skull cap, had additional injuries to the face on the right side of the head. So maybe she was beaten also with hands or something, or hit in the right side of the face with the same object as the one that hit her skull. Joseph Gabriel died from a single powerful blow to the right side of his skull. Remember, that was the baby boy. Celia Gabriel, the 7-year-old, had 1 hole from the mattock in the right side of the face. In addition, the child's mouth and jaw were smashed with an iron band to silence her. So apparently maybe she tried to scream or started to scream. So the killer purposely hit her in the mouth and jaw area. The fatal injury was inflicted on her with a pocket knife throat slit. So then her throat was slit. So she was hit with the mattock, had 1 hole on the right side of the face. In addition, her mouth and jaw were smashed with an iron band. And then she also had her throat slit. The pocket knife, which was hidden together with the iron band on top of the hayloft, belonged to Andreas Gruber. So this website is saying that the weapons used belonged to Andreas Gruber, which maybe whoever killed the family just got the weapons from the farm, because back then all farms would have such weapons and they knew it. They didn't have to necessarily bring their own. And if they were hiding out in the barn or the attic for this home for several days prior to the murders, or knew about this house and the setup of this house, they would know where the weapons would be, where the farm tools would be. Weapons of the crime. These illustrations are faithful reproductions according to witness statements. So these are just reproductions. Okay, number one is a faithful replica according to the testimony of George, the farmhand. He was working on the Hinterkaifecker farm at the time and observed how Andreas Gruber mounted the screw thread on the mattock. Important, the screw protruded on both sides. This meant that the length could be lengthened or shortened as desired, depending on how far it was needed to penetrate the intended target. So this could be maneuvered to be longer or shorter. Like you could loosen it and then push it through more to make it a longer screw. And 3, this duplicates according to the witnesses. And I guess that's the iron band. Yeah, that's okay. So 1, the mattock, 2, the pocket knife, and 3, the iron band. About the mattock, it says Andreas Gruber himself mounted the clamps and the protruding 8mm threaded screw on the mattock. The screw protruding upwards in the picture was deliberately placed in such a way that when it struck the pig's skull, it deliberately caused brain death, similar to a bolt gun. This required a lot of practice, a lot of experience, and precise aiming of the deer hoe, the weighted head of the tool. Pocket knife. The wound that led to Celia's final death was inflicted with a pocket knife. Andreas Gruber owned such a knife, which he carried with him at all times. Iron bands. Celia's screams were silenced on the night of the murder with an iron band. Andreas Gruber was in possession of such an iron band. All the murder weapons were already in the yard before the night of the murder. The murder weapons 1, 2, and 3 were so well hidden by the murderer that they only came to light when the yard was demolished. So none of these weapons were found until they demolished the farm. Evidence includes the evidence. A curious murder too convicts the killer. Andreas Gruber was the unlawful owner of the mattock. He stole the 2 years before from his neighbor, the local voluntary town spokesman, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Afterwards, Andreas Gruber rebuilt the mattock with his own hands. He clamped the blade with 2 iron clamps so that it was firmly fixed. Finally, he secured everything together with a continuous 8mm thread and 2 locking nuts. The mattock, see original replica on the right, was a simple but ingenious construction of Andreas Gruber's own. The long, flat blade was used for removing weeds, and the threaded screw, which protruded 30mm, see picture, was used as a bolt for killing pigs. Inevitably, he must have acquired the striking technique and anatomical knowledge there. For Andreas Gruber, the mattock was a kind of manual hand bolt striking implement. If the protruding thread was too short to kill the animal, one simply loosened both lock nuts and thus changed the length of the thread as desired. Then both lock nuts were tightened again. The victims were killed in the same way as the pigs, see picture below. The mattock couldn't be too heavy, it had to lie well in the hand so that it could be used for precise killing. Being too heavy would lead to the tool being awkward and imprecise. The blow was always equally powerful and measured, regardless of whether the victim was standing or already lying on the ground. So the person who struck with the protruding screw must have been familiar with the effect. Because when the mattock was first used, the murderer already knew how and where he could fatally injure people with the screw. It was not only the precise and careful striking with the threaded screw that required practice, but also the quick extraction from the skull had to be practiced. If the victim fell to the ground during the first blow and the thread was not pulled out in time, it could be bent by the falling weight, or the mattock could be torn out of the hand of the performer. I'd just like to stop here and say, If this tool once belonged to Lorenz Schlittenbauer and Andreas Gruber had stolen it from him, wouldn't he also be able to know how to use one of these? Wouldn't they both know how to slaughter pigs? They both had farms and lived on farms, living the farm life. I mean, that's how you lived. You slaughtered your own animals, grew your own food and stuff. Wouldn't they both be aware of various farm tools? So I don't think that proves that Andreas Gruber murdered his family. The impact of this special design was known to the killer, an untrained person who had not hit his target head at all because the 8mm thread is about 150 millimeters behind the assumed point of impact. An untrained person would have assumed to hit with the heavy metal head of the tool, that would be me, rather than the screw further up from it. Despite the stressful situation, however, the killer struck in a measured and controlled manner. See Victoria's skull, non-focused precision blows without shattering the skull. Well, yes, but wouldn't Lorenz Schlittenbauer also be able to know that and do that? And wouldn't maybe a random person or one of the other suspects, or some unknown killer also be able to figure that out? A lot of people back then were farmers, pig slaughterers, so I don't think that necessarily proves that Andreas was the killer. Andreas Gruber killed his pigs as shown in the symbolic picture below. So we'll move on from that. I don't want to see the pig get killed. I'll read this part here. It says the aim of hitting was not to crush the pig's skull. If the skull is struck too hard, the brain cannot be utilized as well. At the time, everything from the animal, including the brain, was eaten. So the weight of the blade had to be taken into account when striking with the screw thread. To do this, a hand was placed close to the blade. See the butcher's right hand in the symbolic picture above. Only in this way could the blow be delivered in a controlled and measured manner. If an angry person were to strike with full force, there would not be much left of the victim's skull after one or two blows at the latest. Victoria alone had 9 holes in her head, her mother 8, and the maid 1. Important, none of these skulls were smashed. Only in Joseph's case did the murderer strike with full force as the blow was delivered through the sturdy pram roof. So does that mean the killer had a personal grudge against Joseph, even though he was just a child, because maybe he represented something to him that angered him? Either let's say Andreas murdered the family and the boy was his son. Was he angry that he had another incestuous, or at least one incestuous child with Victoria, or he didn't want to have to deal with another child in the home? Or if Andreas was the killer, was he upset that Victoria had a child by another man, either Lorenz Schlittenbauer or some other man? Was Andreas Gruber jealous of his daughter, who he had victimized and controlled all of her life, that she had had a child with another man, or was it his child? Also, let's say Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the murderer. Was he upset that Victoria had a child with her father or another man? Was he jealous, or was he upset that he had a child that he didn't want to take care of? Like it was his child, but he didn't want to have to deal with it or take care of it. Or he was just angry at Victoria and took it out on the child in addition to the whole family. Or maybe they just killed the baby with such force because they just wanted to get it over quickly, because they had already killed the other family member, so they just hit him because he was smaller. Maybe they didn't mean to hit him with such force, but because he was smaller, they did more damage to him. The circumstantial mosaic. Clue number 1, Andreas Gruber had a criminal record. Andreas Gruber had a criminal record for incest against his daughter Victoria and served 1 year in prison. Yes, he did. Apparently Victoria also got in trouble and I think had to spend some time in prison. I don't know how long. I guess because she was an adult at the time, they both got in trouble, which I understand. I feel bad for her because she was a victim, obviously, of her father's control and perversion. But I guess she had to suffer too in prison because she was an adult at the time. Clue number two, irascibility. Andreas Gruber was known for his extremely aggressive and brutal treatment of his wife, children, and neighbors. Well, that's true. He obviously, if he did that to his daughter, he was a piece of crap. It doesn't surprise me that he would be aggressive or mean, because if he's able to do that to his own daughter, of course he would treat his wife and everybody else like crap. Clue number three, brutality. Andreas Gruber was quick to attack people with dangerous objects such as a scythe, pitchfork, or shotgun. So apparently he had a history of violence with other people and with his family, and was just all around a crazy, mean nut. And that's, maybe a motive for somebody to want to kill him. Doesn't necessarily mean that he killed his family. If he had been that way all this time and hadn't killed them yet. Clue number four, child abuse. Neighbors wanted to report Andreas Gruber for child abuse, but refrained from doing so because they were concerned that doing so would only cause more suffering to the children. Andreas Gruber beat his children. Often they did not even get anything to eat. He locked his children in the cold cellar for many days during winter. Sophie, one of his daughters, even died as a result of the abuse. So apparently, Andreas Gruber and his wife, Cecilia Gruber, had other children that didn't make it to adulthood. At least one, apparently, if this is true. Clue number five, Andreas Gruber announced the way of killing. If Victoria had been involved with other men without being pregnant by her father, Andreas Gruber would have beaten his daughter to death. Statement by Victoria Gabriel, to Lorenz S. That's the better thing, that I'm pregnant by the father, Andreas Gruber. Otherwise, he would beat me to death. So they're saying that apparently Victoria Gabriel had told Lorenz that it was better for her father to think Joseph was his, because otherwise he would beat her to death. I guess he was so jealous and so controlling. He didn't want her to have relationships with any other men. So if it's true that she made that statement, that is awful. But it doesn't mean that her father killed her and the rest of the family. Clue number six, the strangulation marks on Victoria's neck. The strangulation marks on Victoria's neck potentially indicate that there was an emotional bond between the perpetrator and the victim. But yes, that not necessarily. A lot of serial killers strangle their victims just because they get off on it. But it also could be, it doesn't rule out Lorenz Schlittenbauer if he had either a romantic relationship with her or a long-term friendship with her. It doesn't rule him out as the killer. Clue number seven, Celia Gabriel was a victim of desire, not killed for her money. The murderer could have killed Celia with one blow. We can presume the murderer wanted to rape Celia, since he did not kill her immediately. Celia was scared to death. Her mother Victoria and her grandmother Cecilia were slain before her eyes, and now it was her turn. Gruber still wanted to finish his plan to Celia. Gruber pounced on Celia, and she panicked. She screamed like a banshee. Her tormentor took the iron band and hit the child's mouth with it to silence her. Celia did not surrender, however, and tore her own hair out from her head in her death throes. Finally, Gruber cut the child's throat with his pocket knife, which he always had in his stable pants pocket. The attempted R explains why Celia was found half naked in the barn and why the child was not killed immediately. Well, it could be true that whoever murdered the family was a pervert predator and tried to assault her sexually, but it doesn't mean necessarily that, at least at that time, that it was Andreas Gruber. There could have been plenty other perverts around, random serial killers who kill for fun and who kill for their perversion. And also, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, how do we know he wasn't a pervert? And are we 100% sure that she was indeed going to be sexually assaulted? Maybe when she was attacked, she was getting ready to go to the restroom. Maybe she was getting undressed or dressed for bed, and the killer got her. Maybe she wasn't lured to the barn. Maybe somebody walked into the house and just picked her up and carried her. And yes, a 7-year-old would be more like, they would probably scream and cry out more. And so maybe that's why she had more damage to her face than the others. The others were caught off guard, and she was caught, she was aware. And because she was smaller, she could have been picked up and carried somewhere, and that would scare her. And they had to beat her to keep her quiet because they were afraid the others who were still alive in the house or on the farm somewhere or in the barn would know, or even, I don't know how far away people could hear far off at other farms in the area, would hear her scream. So they had to quieten her. That doesn't necessarily mean she was going to be sexually assaulted. Maybe she was going, to get undressed, to put on her bedclothes, or she might have been found in her bedclothes. I haven't gotten to that part yet. Can't remember if she was found in her. She might have been found. I think they were all found in their bedclothes, except maybe the older grandmother Cecilia. But maybe she was, going to the restroom, to the outhouse or something. So I'm not sure what that means. Maybe her grandfather slash possible father, if, who knows if Andreas Gruber wasn't also her father, if he was that jealous of Victoria having relationships with other men and he had abused her for so long. But what if Andreas was fixing or trying to sexually assault her, and the killer was hiding in the attic, and the killer got found out in the attic, so he's had to start killing people. Maybe Andreas was the first victim, and he was in the barn with the 7-year-old. And so whoever's hiding in let's say a random serial killer or robber hiding in the attic saw that, or he made a noise and Andreas realized somebody was up in the attic or whatever, or in the barn hayloft. And so then he got in a fight with the intruder while he was trying to assault his granddaughter slash possible daughter. That's a possible scenario, because if Andreas was a mean, perverted, incestuous abuser, if somebody was hiding out in the attic around the time of the murders, before the murders, or it was the killer was somebody who had already worked for the family and knew how he was, maybe abuse was just going on in the home all the time, and so for her to be found half naked, unless they have proof, which I don't think they do, that, or any evidence of actual, like, obviously back then they didn't have DNA, so if they don't have any evidence that somebody other than Andreas abused her, or any evidence that she wasn't just going to use the restroom somewhere, that maybe the murderer of the family wasn't a pervert. It's possible some killers are just killers and not also perverts. Maybe he wasn't interested in children like that. But we know Andreas Gruber was, because we know he had served time in prison for incest with his daughter. She was an adult at the time, but it was known around town that it had started with at least Victoria since she was younger, underage, or a child. Okay, it says the ingenious hiding place. Only an insider could know that there was a large enough cavity up above the kitchen and the false floor for the misshapen and at least 80-centimeter long mattock. This would be a completely illogical and no way comprehensible action for an out-of-town murderer. Well, maybe not an out-of-town murderer unless they just got lucky and happened to find it. If somebody had been hanging around at the house, living up in the attic or hanging out in the attic, hiding from the family for days, then it's possible they could have already known every part of the house. Like when the family was gone, maybe to church or wherever, did they explore the whole house and steal food and stuff even before the murders? But also, people who worked on the farm would know, possibly. So it doesn't necessarily mean it had to be Andreas, since, it doesn't necessarily mean Andreas was the only one who would know about this hiding place. No out-of-town perpetrator hides murder weapons that do not belong to him, mattock, pocket knife, and iron band, in a foreign house with such considerable effort, high risk, and a lot of time involved, only to then make his escape. Well, no, maybe not some random killer who did not know this family or know this area, but somebody who had worked on the farm or somebody who lived nearby and knew the goings-ons and the happenings and had been in the farm before would know about it. So I don't think that necessarily means it had to be Andreas was the only one who could hide a weapon there. See, what we call weapons are just farm tools. They didn't become weapons until they were used to murder the family. So the only reason whoever killed them would hide them was to, hide the blood and to hide what was used to kill them, to hide the blood and the hair and the physical evidence on the murder weapons, and so that the investigators wouldn't be able to find the actual weapons that killed the family. But it doesn't mean that Andreas was the only one who would do that. And if Andreas, who lived there, killed the family, he wouldn't hide it up. He wouldn't hide the murder weapon because it was his tool, his regular tool, and people would know that he had these regular farm tools on his property. So Andreas would probably, if Andreas did it, he would clean up the weapon because it's not like they had DNA back then. So he would clean up the weapon, maybe clean the blood or whatever to make the police think that some random killer brought his own weapon and killed the family. He would, he wouldn't, if he was smart, he wouldn't hide his own farm tools. What you would do, you would clean them up and just put them back where they normally go. It was not unusual at all for farmers to have axes, pickaxes, machetes, different various kinds of farm tools and farm equipment. And it's not unusual at all for anybody to have a penknife or pocket knife in their pockets. So I don't think this necessarily means that Andreas was the murderer. It says Andreas Gruber did not destroy the murder weapon for the following reasons. Okay, so let's see the reasons. He was too cheap and miserly. He would not possibly destroy or throw away tools that were still usable. Or this is just their guess. Or, I mean, how do they know Andreas was cheap? Okay, maybe I've heard, that the family was well off, but so they were good at saving money. But I mean, I still think he would just clean them and set them aside. And if he went crazy and killed his family, maybe he was planning. Let's say he did do this. If he went crazy and killed his family, he would have cleaned these off, put them back to where they went, or he himself would have just run away because he would know that everybody would know that he did it. If he was there hiding out at the family farm a few days after the murders, if he was the one doing all that stuff. It says he was 100% convinced that no one would find the murder weapons. Well, I don't think that's true. How would they know that he was convinced of that? I don't necessarily agree with some of their theories on why they think he did it. I don't think it proves anything. Clue number 9, the injury of Andreas Gruber. Andreas Gruber died from a fall on the tip of the heavy pickaxe, which was found in the animal feeding trough on April 4th, 1922. This tore open Andreas Gruber's carotid artery, causing him to bleed to death within a very short time. So they're saying he just happened to randomly fall on the tip of his pickaxe after he murdered his family, and then he died on top of them or near them in the hay pile. The flesh was torn open on the right side of his cheek, and the cheekbone protruded. He only had this one injury, which was massively different from the others. Okay? See, someone who had intended to kill Andreas Gruber would have killed him in the same way as the other victims. Not necessarily. Maybe it wasn't necessary. Maybe they got him one good shot with a pickaxe. Andreas Gruber, however, did not have a single hole in his skull. An outsider would also have struck Andreas Gruber several times to be quite sure that he could no longer be a danger to him. Maybe Andreas got it first. Then Cecilia, seeing her grandfather, even though he is a monster, being murdered, started screaming out, so the killer started striking her. And he had to turn his attention to somebody else, another one of the victims, whether it's a little girl or somebody else came into the barn, and he couldn't focus on the grandfather. But luckily for him, the grandfather was dead because he happened to get a fatal injury with just one hit. So I don't necessarily think Andreas Gruber was a murderer, and they can tell this by he just accidentally fell on a pickaxe and that's how he died. He could have very well been murdered also. Clue number 10, habits, the tear-off calendar. According to the Criminal Investigation Department, the crime was committed on the evening of March 31st, 1922. However, the tear-off calendar in the Hinterkaifeck kitchen showed the same date for the day on which the bodies were found, April 1st, 1922. Accordingly, one of the family must have still been alive on April 1st, one day after the crime. Tearing off the calendar days was a sacred ritual at that time and a habit that was always celebrated by the same person, usually the head of the family. Well, I don't know what the tradition and normal thing was back then for German. It doesn't mean that Andreas Gruber was the one who tore off the calendar day. And it says on which the bodies were found April 1st. I don't think they were found April 1st. They were found a few days later, weren't they? Maybe I misunderstood something. But their theory is because the page had been changed that Andreas Gruber had been the one who had changed the calendar, and I don't think that's true. And it could be that maybe before bed on March 31st, maybe the grandmother, maybe Andreas before he was murdered, before the grandmother was murdered, or even Victoria. Why couldn't she tear off the calendar? Maybe they didn't really care who tore off the calendar. Maybe before going to bed they tore it off so the next morning it would say April 1st. I mean, how did these people know exactly who tore off the calendar? No out-of-town murderer stays in the murder house after such a terrible deed, waits there for the next day, and then updates the calendar. None other than the murderer himself has torn the sheet with the 31st of March from the tear-off calendar. Well, yes, the murderer could have torn off the calendar, but we don't know the murderer. It still doesn't tell us that the murderer was Andreas Gruber or Lorenz Schlittenbauer or one of the ex-farm hands who had worked on the farm. Anybody can tear off a page from a calendar. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were also the murderer. It doesn't necessarily mean that Andreas Gruber had to be the one to tear it off either. Like I said, it could have been one of the family members while they were still alive, obviously, on the night of March 31st before they went to bed. Somebody tore it off to get ready for the next day. Clue number 11, the watchdog. The home security system of the time, the watchdog was left alive by the murderer, as the dog was apparently still needed. The watchdog, a yellow Spitz, was considered very alert in the neighborhood. He would have alerted for every visitor and barked loudly. But since the danger came from within the house, there was no reason for the dog to sound the alarm. An out-of-town murderer would have killed the watchdog, as its yelping and barking would have attracted other people's attention. I disagree with that. To me, that doesn't necessarily mean that Andreas had to be the killer. It could mean somebody else the dog knew was the murderer. It could have been one of the farm hands the dog was used to seeing. Dogs can be very friendly if they know you, so it could have been one of the farm hands. It could have been a neighbor. It could have been Lorenz Schlittenbauer. but it doesn't necessarily mean this doesn't prove that it was Andreas Gruber just because the dog was kept alive. The dog was probably kept alive because the dog couldn't talk. He couldn't tell who the murderer was. So the killer wasn't concerned about killing the dog. The dog wasn't giving him any problems. The dog was just there. An out of towner would never have attacked the family at this conspicuously bad time since no one was in bed in the surrounding farms at that time. Well, see, they keep using the word out of towner. I agree it probably wasn't an out of towner, meaning a random stranger, but I do believe it was somebody who knew the family. I just don't necessarily think it was Andreas Gruber. Clue number 12. The murderer stayed on the farm after the crime. Andreas Gruber was forced to stay on the farm because he did not know where to flee to. If he had fled to his parents, they would have noticed immediately that something was wrong. Well, he was 63. Assuming his parents were still living, they would have been very old probably. And he wouldn't necessarily have to go there. He had money, and apparently, from what I've read, if it's true and accurate, he had money and gold and stuff. So why not just go somewhere to a city, another country, and lose yourself in the crowd? Andreas Gruber could not flee abroad either because he did not know his way around there. Andreas Gruber was therefore forced to stay in Hinterkaifeck. He was trapped in his own house. I don't think he was. I think if he had killed the family, he would know how to run off just as good as any other criminal, or try to anyway. Especially if you got money. For anybody, whether you're a criminal or not, it takes money to travel. That's all you need. Money, transportation, one way or the other, but money can pay for transportation. In the process, the murderer demonstrably cared for the animals. Maybe that's why the murderer didn't kill the dog, because he cared about the animals, even though he just murdered a family. He, you know, didn't have a problem with animals. The murderer did not sleep in his bed after the crime, but up in the hayloft, leaving haystacks behind. The murderer removed the roof tiles to keep a lookout for the police. Likewise, the murderer laid out a carpet of hay to muffle his footsteps so that no one would hear him if the police entered his house. But see, that makes me think that it wasn't a family member. It may not even been Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Was he missing from his home? Did his kids, or if he had a wife at the time? I know his previous wife had died, but was he remarried? Did his kids, stepchildren, anybody else in his family, or other neighbors notice that he was missing from his home? If somebody was hiding out at the Hinterkaifeck farm, did anybody notice that Lorenz or any other person in the community was missing during that time and could have been the murderer? Or was it one of the former, or I don't know, even former current workers at the farm have done it? Were they hiding up there? Maybe they no longer worked there, but they were hiding there before and after the murders. And like I said, maybe they didn't want to kill the family, but they ended up having to kill the family because they got spotted. Andreas finally, Andreas had been saying that he heard strange noises. Even the previous maid said. So maybe somebody in the family finally saw or heard somebody hiding up in the hayloft or the attic part of the house, and they were caught. So that's why they had to kill the family. And then they made their escape a bit later on. The killer attached ropes to various beams so that he could quickly lower himself to the ground should anyone enter the house stable. The murderer even defecated in the hayloft because he did not want to leave his post lookout. Well, that doesn't mean it was Andreas Gruber. That just to me means it could have been one of the farm workers, previous farm workers, or I don't know, the current farm workers, somebody who knew the farm, knew the family, or somebody in the community who knew the goings on of the family, even if they didn't. But I guess everybody in that community knew pretty much everybody. But they knew of the farmhouse. They knew apparently that you could hide up in the attic in the hayloft. There was probably somebody who did work on the farm who knew, that they could hide up there. Maybe somebody who didn't currently have a place to live, so they, because it was cold and snowy, in that winter, maybe somebody was hiding up there quite a long time, and they would, you know, when the family wasn't there, they would go out to wherever in the forest or whatever and hide, and then they would come back at night, maybe sneak into the barn and up in the hayloft. And I don't know if you could get to the attic of the house part of the building from the hayloft area, but maybe you could. Remains of rinds of smoked meat were found near the lookout. We can assume Andreas Gruber preferred the good smoked meat because he suspected that he would not get any more smoked meat for a long time. Well, that's just ridiculous. That doesn't mean it was Andreas Gruber. Anybody hiding out in that house would, get whatever food was available. You have to eat to live. And if he's hiding out in the house and not planning to go anywhere for a bit, of course, he would eat whatever was available to him. And he would eat up there because if somebody did come to the house, he didn't want to be seen. He had hid up there before the murder, so he was hiding out up there after the murders, but that doesn't mean it was Andreas Gruber. No out-of-town offender would attach escape or reaction ropes, remove tiles from the roof, defecate in the hayloft, and wait for the police to arrive before making his escape. How did they know the murderer was waiting for the police to arrive? He was just hiding out there, kept the animals fed and stuff, so hoping that nobody would think anything suspicious until he decided what to do, or decided when the coast was clear to sneak off. At the time, the criminal I don't know how cold it was in Germany at that time, the beginning of April, but maybe he had to wait until, it was reasonably good weather so he could travel off. At the time, the Criminal Investigation Department assumed that the escape ropes, the removed bricks, etc., had already been placed before the night of the crime. However, this is not possible because it is known that Andreas Gruber had mentioned in a recent conversation that he thoroughly searched the house, the stable, and the hayloft in the night from March 30th, 1922 to March 31st, 1922 because he suspected riffraff. He could not find anything conspicuous. The two escape ropes tied tightly, the human excrement, the missing tiles in the roof, the rinds of smoked meat, the impressions left from someone laying in the hay carpet, all of this therefore only came to the hayloft after the night of the murder. Strangers could not have hidden in the hayloft upstairs at all because there was neither a separate room nor a firewall up there. The upper floor was one big room where you could look over freely from one side to the other. Oh, so you see, I guess from the hayloft you could see the attic part of the whole house. So like one side was the house, one side was the barn, and then the machine room and all that. So if it's just one big area, I guess a person who is hiding up there would have to leave at times. So maybe, the murderer hid up there, but he wasn't up there all the time while the family was still alive. But one day he finally did get caught. And so he ended up murdering the family so he wouldn't get in trouble for being there. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I don't think, at least not now, I'm not thinking Andreas Gruber had to be the murderer of the family. Clue number 13, gold and silver money were not stolen. At the time, the criminal police assumed a six-fold robbery murder. However, large amounts of gold and silver money, approximately 100,000, were left behind. It's my understanding that money was stolen, that possibly Victoria had gotten money out of the bank in recent days. So they had paper money there. Maybe that's all he wanted. He didn't want to have lots of gold and silver on his person. The murderer, if it wasn't, Andreas, or, if it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, he didn't want to be caught with extra gold and silver. Maybe somebody did take some paper money from the home. We don't know, if Andreas Gruber was like he was and very controlling and crazy and all that. We don't know how much money he had hidden up in his house. Maybe there were some gold and silver missing and a lot of paper money missing that people just aren't aware of. This website itself says that he was a miser. Was he such a miser that he had money hidden in that house that even other family members didn't know about or whatever? And so the murderer of the family found some money, and he did, when he left the home, take money with him, a good amount of money that he could fit on his person, in his pockets or whatever. Who knows how much money he made off with? So I don't think we necessarily know for sure how much money was in the home, how much gold, silver, or paper money was in the home and how much the murderer might have taken off with him. The perpetrator preferred to go to great lengths to hide his murder weapons instead of looking for all the money. Let's see, the murderer who hid the mattock upstairs in the false floor knew the house inside out. So why didn't he steal all the money that was in the unlocked wardrobe in Victoria's room? Because it wasn't the money he was after, but silly. I mean, there are perverts who will kill a whole family just to get to a child if they're a perverted child predator. But I'm not so sure silly was necessarily, the reason they did what they did. Maybe, they just took the opportunity to try to assault her because they were there. But I don't think that's why they killed the family. And I don't think they necessarily killed the family because there was money in the house to be got. I think maybe somebody was hiding up there in their attic in their home on the property for a while. I don't know how long, but maybe they just got caught being on the property, and so they just ended up killing the whole family because they had to. They didn't want to be caught. Now, could it be a pervert hiding up there watching the family? The whole town knew that Andreas Gruber was a pervert. Did somebody enjoy watching the family goings on? Somebody as perverted as Andreas Gruber was? Or was it just a random person staying up there because he didn't have anywhere else to stay at the time? Was it a robber who's planning on stealing from him? And maybe he did. We just don't know how much they actually got because he didn't feel the need to take everything in the house. If the killer was Lorenz Slattenbauer, did he not need the money or want the money? That wasn't his goal. If he did it, he had more personal reasons to kill the family. Maybe if Lorenz was there, he went to see Victoria, or he was hiding up in the hayloft for whatever reasons. Did he get caught by Andreas Gruber? And so then he ends up killing the whole family. And maybe the family wasn't killed in the order that people think. Maybe Andreas Gruber was the first one to go, and then the bodies were stacked up like they were after they were all killed. I'm not sure. Clue number 14, the bakehouse wash house. The murderer burned the bloody clothes, Cecilia and Silly's, in the bakehouse oven and cleaned his own with hot water. Okay, this is the first time I've ever heard this. So the bloody clothes were burned in the bakehouse oven and cleaned his own with hot water. So is that what smelled? Is that what the people who passed by, or the person who passed by the house, smelled coming from their stove? Was clothes burning? Is that what smelled so odd to them? While doing so, he took the dog with him and tied it to the bakehouse so that the dog could warn him of neighbors or the police. No out-of-towner would be so careless as to go to the trouble of burning the bloody clothes in the oven outside after his cruel deed. The oven stood near the field road, which people such as Michael Plockle sometimes walked past, so the risk of being discovered by the smoke and the acrid stench would have been far too great. The effort to light the fire would also have been too great in this cold weather. According to witness Michael Plockle, the air stank of burnt rags on the evening of April 1st, 1922. The oven was usually always fired up on the same day once a week and at the same hour, early in the morning and not late in the evening, and was only used for baking bread as well as for heating the water for laundry. Okay, so apparently the police knew that Cecilia and Silly's clothes had been burned. I've never heard that before. Did they find remnants of it? Or it's just because their clothes were missing that they assumed they had been burned? To my understanding, Cecilia was fully clothed. I think in her day clothes, and the others were in their night clothes, but I'm not sure. But still, this does not mean that Andreas Gruber was the murderer. Clue number 15, removing traces, covering the bodies. The murderer covered the bodies with hay and a door so that he would not have to look at them. He tried to bury the bodies right next to where they lay. However, this was made difficult for him because the ground was frozen. In a statement by Lorenz Schlittenbauer to the teacher, Schlittenbauer, literally said, he, Andreas Gruber, so Lorenz Schlittenbauer knew who he was talking about, dug a shovel-deep hole, but he didn't get far because the ground was frozen. Well, maybe Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the murderer, but maybe Lorenz Schlittenbauer just could tell by, he had seen the crime scene, knew that it looked like somebody had tried to dig a hole. Didn't the police also see the crime scene? What did they say? Did they think it also looked like somebody had tried to dig a hole? I mean, it's just common sense. In the winter in Germany, and anywhere else, the ground would be frozen. So that's why any murderer would just leave bodies laying there or stacked up. And if Lorenz Schlittenbauer actually said that, when he said he could have just meant the killer, but not saying meaning Andreas. He could have just meant himself. He could have meant somebody he did not know who the killer was if he wasn't the killer. Clue number 16, Andreas Gruber was not wanted as the successor on the parental farm. The parents did not sign over their farm to their eldest son, Andreas, but gave it to Michael Gruber, his brother, who was 3 years younger. Probable reason, Andreas Gruber could not handle people and animals. So are they talking about Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the family? His parents did not sign the farm over to him, or did Andreas Gruber have a son, Andreas Gruber, and Michael Gruber, but he gave it to Michael, not Andreas? I don't understand that. I'll find out in the future, though. So it's clue number 17, murder weapon, Andreas Gruber's pocket knife. The pocket knife was a tool that Gruber always carried with him. Something always had to be cut with it, snacks in the field, cords, etc. The knife also stayed in his trouser pocket overnight. So how was an outsider supposed to get hold of the knife? The trousers with the knife inside hung in Andreas Gruber's bedroom. That doesn't mean anything to me. A lot of people carry knives around. The killer could have found the knife in the house and stole it if he had been hiding out in the house before the murders. It's just, just because Andreas Gruber had a knife, or even if his personal knife was used, doesn't mean that he was the killer. Clue number 18, Andreas Gruber wore his sleeping clothes on the day he was found. If he had heard anything suspicious in his bedroom, he would have got dressed. How do they know that? If you think somebody's broken into your house, you may just run out, in an emergency. You may not take the time to get dressed. Gruber had to go through the kitchen to get to the stable where the new maid could be since it was her first day. It can be ruled out that Gruber went into the barn in his pants when it was snowing outside. Andreas Gruber walked around in sleeping clothes one day after he had slain everyone because he had to wash the blood splashes out of his only stable outfit. He hung the damp stable clothes up to dry in the living room and then holed up in the hayloft. How did they know these sequence of events happened? This is just them guessing? Clue number 19, overkill. The murderer struck Victoria 9 times and his wife Cecilia 8 times. This means that an overkilling took place. Andreas Gruber could not cope with the fact that his daughter wanted to leave him. He took out his hatred, frustration, and anger on her and the others. Andreas Gruber may have very well had a lot of anger toward his daughter and wife and family. It supposedly the 7-year-old girl had told a classmate or a teacher or somebody that she had not gotten any sleep the night before because her grandfather and mother had gotten in an argument, and her mother had run out and they had to go searching for her. So obviously, this family had a lot of drama going on and a lot of trauma over the years. But it doesn't mean that Andreas killed them all that night. Exonerating facts for Lorenz Schlittenbauer. If Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been the murderer, he would not have hidden his mattock in the murder house and waited until it was found by the men demolishing it and handed over to the police. Well, it doesn't mean Andreas Gruber was the killer, and it doesn't mean Lorenz Schlittenbauer wasn't the killer. I believe whoever, if it was hidden, then the person who hid it, that had blood and hair on it, it was the murder weapon. So whoever hid it was the murderer. But I don't think it necessarily means it had to be Andreas Gruber or Lorenz Schlittenbauer. But I don't think it means that Lorenz Schlittenbauer wasn't the murderer. If Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been the murderer, he would have had enough time after abandoning the Hinterkaifecker farm to retrieve the mattock, the pocket knife, and the bloody iron band from their safe hiding place in order to destroy them. But since only the murderer, who died shortly after the crime, could know where the mattock, the pocket knife, and the iron band were hidden, they remained in hiding until the farm was demolished 1 year later. Now, I think the murderer just hid them, so if he was found, he wouldn't be found with the murder weapons. And the murder weapons had evidence on them. Why the murderer didn't take the time to wash them if he had enough time, I don't know. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe it wasn't his concern because he knew he's going to be leaving, and there's no reason for him to worry about them that much. He just got rid of them after the murderers, but he knew where they were if he needed them. The farm had been cleared for demolition and stood empty for some time. Lorenz Schlittenbauer did not even help to demolish the farm. Well, why does he have to? This means that if he had been the murderer, he had to 100% expect that the neighbors would find his blood-stained, fingerprinted murder weapons used to kill people. Okay, well, if Lorenz Schlittenbauer wasn't concerned about fingerprints, then that's a good sign that he wasn't the killer, but it does not mean that Andreas Gruber was the killer. The mattock originally belonged to Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He always left it covered in the field to continue working with it the next day. He did not want to carry it home with him every time. Andreas Gruber discovered the mattock and stole it. So I guess it's known around the community that Andreas stole it from him. Completely illogical and incomprehensible action of an out-of-town insider. Nobody comes to a farm without a weapon in order to then kill 4 adults and 2 children with a tool that is foreign to him with a sophisticated beating technique. Then hides the murder weapon in a house that is foreign to him with considerable effort, high risk, and a lot of time involved, only to then make his escape. See clue number 8. Well, there have been cases where murderers stay in a house for some time after they murder or slaughter a whole family. But also, maybe he did not intend to murder the people when he came to the farm. That wasn't his goal. Maybe it was robbery or to steal something, or to just hide out there to stay there because he didn't have anywhere else to stay and it was cold outside. When the bloody mattock was found during the demolition of the Hinterkaifeck farm, Lorenz Schlittenbauer immediately admitted in the presence of his neighbors that the tool they had found belonged to him. Lorenz Schlittenbauer's original statement, "This is my mattock, I recognize it, so it was there in the yard all the time." By this, he meant that his neighbor should finally realize that he could not have been the murderer because at no time did he know where the murder weapon was hidden. If he had been the murderer, he would certainly not have hidden his mattock in the house where everyone was slain. But also remember, back then they didn't have DNA, so he could have wiped fingerprints off of it, but it ended up he didn't need to because the police didn't even take fingerprints. But he could have wiped his fingerprints off of it, and so he wasn't worried about that. And there wasn't, DNA, and also the blood, the victim's blood and hair being on it didn't matter, so he didn't have to wipe that off. So there's no reason for him to clean the weapons, and he knew his fingerprints weren't on them because he had wiped them off if Lorenz was the murderer. Lorenz Schlittenbauer's suspicion that Andreas Gruber had slain his family was confirmed when the main murder weapon was found in the ingenious hiding place. The eyewitness, Michael Plockel, testified that he had seen Lorenz Schlittenbauer with a battery-powered torch on the evening of April 1st, 1922 at the bakehouse in Hinterkaifeck. So that would be putting Lorenz at the crime scene, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that more likely mean that he's a good suspect? Schlittenbauer could therefore not have murdered the people because they were demonstrably beaten to death on the evening of 31st of March 1922, i.e. one day earlier. No one returns one day later to the place where they had killed 6 people the day before. You might, if the bodies haven't been discovered yet and you live nearby and you know that, you know, what's going on in the house, or you're not the murderer and you think their family's just away or out. In addition, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was unable to kill 6 people in a row because of his asthma. This was the conclusion reached by the authorities at the time. I don't necessarily think asthma means that a man couldn't easily kill a child and an older woman and a middle-aged woman and an old man. So that to me doesn't mean that Lorenz Schlittenbauer wasn't the murderer. But also, some people are so hung up on that the calendar was somebody had ripped the page of the calendar, and so this website says it had to be Andreas Gruber as the murderer because he's the only one who would do that. Well, maybe they weren't murdered on March 31st. Maybe they were murdered April 1st. How do they know what time they were murdered? Lorenz Schlittenbauer would have been more likely to get out of his house in the middle of the night to kill this family if he was the murderer. They could have been killed at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 1 a.m. Remember, not just, a night or two before, the 7-year-old had told the school that they were up all night trying to find Victoria in the middle of the night. So who knows what time this family went to bed? Who knows who were all in bed and then taken out of bed or called out of bed to then be slaughtered? So, who knows what time they were murdered? They could have been murdered March 31st that night. They could have been murdered overnight or early into the morning of April 1st. We don't know exactly what time of the night they're murdered. We just assume they're murdered overnight because, we know when people last saw them alive, and we know that, the girl didn't show up to school, and nobody had actually seen any of the family members when they walked by the farm. And they were wearing their night clothes, some of them were, but, they could have been murdered at any time when they was getting ready, in between the time they was getting ready to go to bed, or in bed, or anywhere during the night up until the early morning. And Lorenz could have just been there. If Lorenz Schlittenbauer had been seen there, did he admit to it, and what did he say he was doing? And if Lorenz Schlittenbauer didn't kill them, he may not have known they were dead. So he could very well have returned to the farm for whatever reason to check on them or whatever. I don't see how that means that he didn't. Lorenz wasn't the murderer. If he was the murderer, he could have returned, to make it look like he had no knowledge that they were dead, but he knew that they were dead because he had killed them. So I don't think that proves one way or the other that Lorenz Schlittenbauer didn't or did do it, or that Andreas Gruber did or didn't do it. In addition, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was unable to kill 6. Oh, I'd already read that. Okay. Like I said, I don't think asthma means he couldn't have done anything. Okay, so that's what this website has for evidence and clues. We're going to click on Death of the Murderer. It says Saturday, April 1st, 1922, around noon, one day after the fivefold murder, 2 coffee traders told the local voluntary town spokesman, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that they had not encountered anyone in Hinterkaifeck. The 2 also mentioned that the dog in the stable had been howling loudly. When Schlittenbauer's son came home from school, he reported that Silly from the farm in question had not appeared at school. Lorenz Schlittenbauer's ears perked up because only one day earlier Andreas Gruber had complained about an obviously unsuccessful burglary. Schlittenbauer offered his unpopular neighbor his help, but he refused. For these reasons, and because his son was living on the farm, the local leader decided to check on Hinterkaifeck on the evening of April 1st, 1922. So Lorenz Schlittenbauer thought Joseph was his son, according to this, and apparently that's why he was at the Hinterkaifeck farm, because two coffee traders that came by. So Schlittenbauer went over there to check things out. When the local guide arrived at the farm, he actually found it deserted. Only the pitiful howling of the watchdog inside the barn could be heard. The guide suspected that something might have happened to the inhabitants and thus also to his son. He pulled open the double-winged gate in order to provide help if necessary. When the local leader entered the barn, he was attacked without warning. Okay, so this website is saying that he went to check on the family in their farm on Saturday the 1st of April, and that he was then attacked by Andreas Gruber. Andreas Gruber had killed his family and was hiding there, scared in the farm, not knowing what to do. And Lorenz showed up to check out things, and Andreas Gruber attacked him. What Lorenz Schlittenbauer had to experience on that night on April 1st, 1922, and what was to change his life forever can be read in the novel The Lark's Call, or in the nonfiction book Der Gruber Wars by Adolf J. Koppel. Okay, so this is where they're trying to sell you their books. So the books might be very good and very interesting. I know they'll be interesting because his case is interesting. But if I read them, only the English one. I can't read the German one. But if I read the English one, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to agree with everything it says. But I think the English one is actually written as fiction, and then the nonfiction one is this one that's in German that I can't read. But this is where they lead you to get their books. But it is a very interesting case. So if you're interested in those books, I would get them. Let's see the biography. Okay, this is Adolf J. Koppel. In November 2012, I saw a report on BR television about the horrific six-fold murder of the Gruber farming family Hinterkaifeck near Munich. All of them, including the maid who had just arrived, had apparently had their skulls bashed in. The criminal police assumed then, 1922, as now, that it was a robbery murder, although nothing was stolen. Okay, right there I'm going to say, how do we know for sure nothing was stolen? If they were that well off, how do we know exactly how much paper money, gold, and silver and stuff they had in the home? Maybe the murderer did make off with some of the money. They just didn't get all of it because they didn't want to carry it all, or they were afraid that they would be caught, or it would be too suspicious if they were caught with it on their person or something. I'm just, trying to think logically. When it was mentioned at the end of the program that everything about this case, which has still not been solved, can be read on the internet, I was immediately hooked. I simply had to know everything about the terrible six-fold murder. There was no way I was going to set out to find the murderer. So the next day, completely unbiased but full of curiosity, I sat down at the computer and opened the site, Hinterkaifeck.net. At last I had all the information at my fingertips and didn't have to be satisfied with the titles of the newspapers and the scanty reports of the police as I had been before. Police reports, witness statements, the curious murder weapon, life on the farm, simply everything could be read there. Among the dead were Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, his daughter Victoria, his granddaughter Silly, his grandson Joseph, and it has grandson in parentheses because remember, people think that was actually his son. But of course, they didn't have DNA tests back then, so we don't know. And the maid, Maria Baumgartner. As it appeared at first glance, all 6 people died through external causes. But anyone who takes a closer look at the character of the farmer, Andreas Gruber, who has a criminal record, must inevitably conclude that only he can be considered responsible for this terrible deed. I agree 100% that Andreas Gruber was a horrible person and would have the capacity to murder his family, especially if it's true that he had other children who he purposely murdered or let die from starvation or whatever in the past. I agree 100%. Andreas Gruber was a piece of you know what. But I don't believe that he can be considered the only person who could have done that terrible deed because, as we know, there are other people capable of slaughtering families. But how can he be the murderer? Because when the criminal police found the six bodies, he was also among the dead. The murders were proven to have happened on March 31st, 1922. Officially, however, the bodies were not found until April 4th, 1922, 4 days later, and a lot can happen in 4 days. So there he's holding some of the weapons. Okay, so this is the website Hinterkaifeck, www.hinterkaifeck.ch/en/biography. It's in German and English, so if anybody is interested in this and if you read German, get it in German. And I don't know the people who run this website. I don't know any. I'm not affiliated with it in any way, but it had information on it and his theories, and so I wanted to, read and see what he had to say, what his theory was. And his theory, it could be plausible that Andreas Gruber murdered his family and then he got murdered, but I just don't think that we could say for sure that that's what happened, or even that that's the most reasonable theory of what happened.